Hey everybody, welcome to First Question. This is episode number 3, and this is where your questions, the ones that get wedged in your mind or your soul after each worship service, find an expression and an opportunity to be asked out loud and answered, and become a way that others who maybe didn't have those questions or weren't aware of those questions can also be engaged. And so I thank you for taking the time to one, engage the worship videos, and then two, participate in first questions, and then of course three, watch this video. As you can see, I'm here in my workspace, at least during the warm weather months, out in my garage. This is where Brienne has shoved me. No, that's not true. I like working out here. It's a good place that I can get a little bit of fresh air and see neighbors. It also means that, at some point during this video, inevitably a FedEx truck is going to roll by, and I'll just have to pause awkwardly. I apologize in advance. So let's get right into it. We've had a few weeks since the last one of these videos, and I've been trying to accumulate enough questions to make one of these videos, and we have that now. A little bit later on in the video, you're going to get a visit from Dick Mickley as he and I discuss some of the first questions that came about, not just from my preaching, but also his recent Sunday in the pulpit. Our first question comes from Thelma Carlson, and she was responding to the June 21st sermon, Inconvenient Truths. And she wrote a very nice but long email, and then I responded, and then she followed up with another email. So I'm going to give you both of her emails at length, because I think they're wonderful, and then I'll take some time to respond here. So in her first email, she wrote, "Your sermon took me back several decades. You see, the University of Akron was one of the first in Ohio to introduce Black American studies. As an English and history major and not knowing where I might end up teaching, I requested and was granted permission to enroll in both BA Lit and History, Black American Lit and History, and thus was introduced to the work of Langston Hughes. I double-checked, and Let America Be America was published in 1936. Being as I was taking the classes around 1970, and the race riots of the 60s and the March in Selma were still on everyone's minds, you can probably imagine that we found Mr. Hughes's works to be quite prophetic. Being the only Caucasian in the class, I can assure you that my eyes were thoroughly opened to the exigencies of being black in America. I'm sorry to say that most of my classmates would probably not be able to see much change in how we treat our black and brown brothers and sisters." His poem Harlem, published in 1951, also comes to mind, if I might quote, "What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode?" Thelma goes on, "Do you agree that his work is prophetic or just an expression of his individual experience? I sometimes fear that the dreams often get tamped down until they explode again. And for the record, I know that we are all precious in God's sight, but we are not all precious in the sight of our fellow man." And then I followed up with her in an email. The contents of that is relatively inconsequential to this, but it did lead her to send another email and ask these questions. "But what about the gifts of the Holy Spirit? Paul speaks to this in several of the epistles. For instance, Romans 12:6, 1 Corinthians 12:10, 12:28, and Ephesians 4:11. Did prophecy cease at the end of the apostolic age, or are we just dealing in semantics? Can someone be a prophet if he does not prophesy about the coming of the kingdom?" In Jeremiah 28:15-17, Jeremiah says that Hananiah made the people trust in a lie, and therefore within this year he would die. And he did. If then a true prophet is known, if his predictions become true, I think that Mr. Hughes could be said to be a true prophet. First, Thelma, thank you so much for such an engaging conversation via email and when we talked on the phone. and for making it so that I had to share another one of Langston Hughes's amazing poems. If I could summarize what I take to be your major point, it's that the prophetic is inherently revelatory. Like your eyes were opened in your Black American Studies courses. That means that the prophets have to be either showing us something new or showing us some ancient wisdom of God, but in a new way that is, salient and pertinent to our own times. So, as a weird example that I just came up with, proclaiming gravity exists is hardly prophetic. However, proclaiming gravity exists to a group of people at the top of a tall building who are about to step off of it so they can float somewhere, well, that might just be a prophetic word in their lives. I do think that prophecies, to be understood as true and not false, do have to come true. However, the problem with that has always been, especially with Old Testament prophecies, the timeline on when this has to happen. That timeline of is this true is rarely understood in advance. So that makes did it happen a sort of dubious identity marker for a prophecy. A much better identity marker for prophecy, I think, is, and I think the biggest and most important identity marker is that a prophecy is either one, directed to a ruling authority of some sort, or two, directed toward the people of God. Throughout the Old Testament, these are the only two recipients of a prophetic word. On some occasions, a prophet will address both, either simultaneously or subsequently. I also think this is a key identity marker that helps us answer your other questions about whether or not we still live in a time of prophecy or whether this time came to a close with Jesus and those first disciples and apostles. I would contend that we not only live in a prophetic age, but that the task of prophecy has been spread throughout all of God's people. You may remember back in my Pentecost sermon, Moses' line, "Would that all the people of God have the Spirit rest upon them," because the Spirit had come and rested on Eldad and Medad, who were back in camp while Moses and the rest of Israel was off at the foot of a mountain. And I proclaimed then that Moses' wish at that moment had been fulfilled in Pentecost. I think something similar is going on here. Certainly in the Old Testament, God raised up specific people as prophets with specific prophetic messages. But I think with the coming of the Spirit, that sort of gift of God is no longer reserved just for some specific individuals, but is actually part of the purview of the entire church, the entire body of Christ. I think we would, as you know, prophecy is a gift of the Spirit, and I don't think there's any reason to believe that the Spirit withholds some gifts from some people. I think we all have some of the gifts of the Spirit, some share of it. Now, some of us, may not feel like we're great teachers, but that doesn't mean that we're not called upon to still teach when we must. And when we do have to teach, we're assured that the Spirit is going to give us words. And so all of these gifts of the Spirit, or if you want to think about it in terms of fruits of the Spirit, and I think those are essentially the same thing because of their origin in the Spirit, I think all of these are available to us and that we are called to take ownership of all of these. In fact, the fruits of the Spirit's a really good example of this. Kindness is a fruit of the Spirit, but we wouldn't accept, a mean, angry Christian walking around treating people meanly and angrily, and then when confronted goes, "Well, the Spirit just didn't give me the fruit of kindness, so it's not my fault." We'd say, no. You have to, dig down in there. The Spirit is definitely giving you that gift of kindness. You're just rejecting it because you're mean and angry. I think prophecy is probably a lot like that. that we're all given certain prophetic gifts, but that most of the time, most Christians aren't taking advantage of those. Um, I mean, at the end of the day, I just don't think who God is a God who withholds gifts from us, especially gifts that will aid us in glorifying Him and loving our neighbor. Like, that wouldn't make sense. I think God is like embarrassing with the riches He's prepared to pour out into our lives. And that more often than not, we just ignore and neglect those riches, to our own peril. Additionally, I would say I wish more Christians would take seriously their role of speaking prophetically to one another in the forms of hope and accountability, of consequence and grace. Those can all be prophetic words. But more importantly, maybe, speaking prophetically to our civic and political leaders. I think that we buy into the separation of church and state way too much. And in doing so, we actively cut off the prophetic gifts that the Holy Spirit is yearning to give us. In fact, one of the reasons, to return to one of your earliest questions about Langston Hughes and is he a prophet, one of the reasons that poets like Langston Hughes may be filling certain prophetic roles is because we, as the church, we have evacuated those roles. Nature abhors a vacuum, which that, if you agree with that, is an ethical call to make sure that we don't retreat from places and purposes that we're supposed to be in. So, sort of boiled down, simple answer, I think you're a prophet, and I hope that I'm a prophet. I think whenever we speak God's truth to one another in a Christian community, that is a prophetic word to one another. And I think that we also have a moral obligation to speak prophetically to the rest of the world. What is witnessing to the Lordship of Christ, if not a prophetic proclamation, right? And so, I think rather than prophecy being like this very unique role to some very unique people in a very unique time period, if ever that was true, and I guess it was at some point, with the advent of Christ and with the sending of His Spirit, we live in a different era. We live in a different moment in redemptive history. And now the prophetic has moved from the unique broadly to all the people of God. And it's really upon us just to figure out how we lean into those gifts and how we partner with God who gives us those gifts and cultivating them more and more in our soul. So thank you for that question. Again, thank you for forcing me to read Harlem. That's one of my favorite Hughes poems. And I really appreciate our conversation on this. Feel free to send any follow-up questions because I'd love to keep this conversation going. Our next question comes from Kevin Crosthwaite. He's responding to the July 5th sermon titled Cognitive Dissonance. And he writes, I have always taken the Romans reading as support for making New Year's resolutions. I can conceive of being better than I am. Most resolutions fail because of the evil at work in my members. Do you agree that this scripture supports the effort to idealize yourself by making resolutions even though they may be doomed to fail? Yep. I mean, I don't want to end there, but I think, Kevin, that your assumptions are right on here, or your thoughts, not even assumptions, are right on here. I think you're thinking well through this. I think the more we embrace change, the better off we will be, both emotionally and spiritually as Christians. Now, I'm not sure if anybody's noticed, but probably 1/3 of everything I write and preach for the church is about change. Like, if you boil down everything I'm putting out there, and if you kind of like get rid of the 90s pop culture references and you really kind of drill down on like the central points of, my First Thoughts devotions and my sermons each week, probably 1/3 are all about responding to change. And now my fear, of course, in terms of preaching and writing this way is that I'm going to be misunderstood as wanting change. And in some of those instances, that's probably the case, but it's not always the case. In fact, I think, sometimes whether we want change or not is a immaterial question. Most of the time, change happens to us, and then we figure out how to lead and live through it, right? This is why I'm always trying to emphasize like the God who's giving us a new gift or a new blessing and what sort of spiritual posture we need to assume, open-handed rather than closed fists. I'm always trying to emphasize those points because I think these things are just happening in life. And that's why I loved that trans-theoretical model of change that I presented on July 5, because it shows that all of life is at some stage in the change cycle. Indeed, it was not an accident that I preached about change on July 4th weekend, that weekend when we celebrate full-on revolution. I mean, revolution is change on steroids. In fact, I would really love it if somebody with a mind for American history, and Kevin, maybe that's you, but anyone who's watching this, somebody with a mind for American history would take the colonies' move from, codependence on the crown to their independence from the crown and sort of map that out using the stages of the trans-theoretical model of change. Because I'd be willing to bet that it maps out pretty seamlessly. That there was a time period where it was precognition. Either we thought things were fine or we weren't prepared to look at the problems that existed in this colonial relationship with the crown. And then eventually we became aware that there was a problem of some sort. And, what helped us move into that cognition stage, or pre-contemplative and contemplative stage, sorry. And then so on and so forth. Like, I bet much of the revolution maps out across the trans-theoretical model of change. But more to your point, Kevin, which I think is about the internal or maybe the interpersonal change via the New Year's resolution, I fully support your thoughts there. If anything, New Year's is just a convenient excuse to move from pre-contemplation to contemplation, right? To take that first step on the change cycle. Truthfully, though, we can choose any moment to do that. In fact, part of the problem with New Year's resolutions is that it tries to blast through too many of the stages of change too quickly. We go from like pre-contemplation on December 31st to contemplation, determination, and action all in the course of like a day or a week. And I think by not letting each of these stages breathe and allow us to adjust to each of those stages, we inevitably falter early on in our attempts for change. Which is why everyone goes to the gym on January 3rd, but it's empty by Valentine's Day on February 14th. Though you have already been locked into that 12-month contract, so you're going to pay for it, 12 times more than you ever really use it. I suspect, and this is what I hope my sermon made clear, or at least clear-ish, that our changes have a higher likelihood of success if we are more intentional about our role in the change process, rather than letting change be something that happens to us or something that we're constantly putting our shoulder against. We just understand that we're always on this change cycle, like every moment of life. As individuals and as a community that we call First Presbyterian Church, we're always somewhere on that change cycle. And so there's no reason to be like pushing against it. Rather, we might want to figure out where we're at and then collectively and communally decide what our next steps are in it. I also had hoped with that sermon that it helps us better understand failure, or in the terms of the trans-theoretical model of change, termination, as not so much a rupture in the change cycle, but just another stage in it. And that would mean that failure is less of a moral deficiency and more a moral opportunity. And I'm not just trying to be, I'm not trying to blow sunshine up any part of your body right now. I suspect most of y'all know that I'm not much of a sunshine blowing sort, but I do think that when we get bogged down with things that we regard as failures, it erodes our capacity to participate in change. And so when we recognize termination of a particular change cycle in our life, we can lament that, all of our good maintenance is now behind us, but we can also recognize, like, okay, I'm going to re-begin this process. I'm going to enter into a new stage of pre-contemplation and then eventually contemplation. And like I definitely said in the sermon, I think we get better each time around the cycle. I think there's, the cycle isn't just a circle. It's kind of like a canonical circle that's, growing us upward. And I think that's a better way to think about it too, though much harder to represent on, an over-the-shoulder image in the sermon. So Kevin, thank you so much for that question. If you've got any sort of change that you want to talk about, maybe Diane's just been baking too many cookies during quarantine and you want to move from pre-contemplation to contemplation on dieting or something, talk with me. Maybe I'm not the best one to talk to about it because my advice will be just to send those cookies over my way to remove the temptation. But yeah, I think we need to just talk more about change as individuals and as a community and sort of like demystify it and demythologize it and make it less scary and less something that we're aggressively against and something that we realize that we're just inherently for because we're always somewhere in the middle of change. All right, I'm going to pause the video here, and when I come back, I'm going to have a very special guest, Dick Mickley. So thanks for watching thus far. Stick around. The second half of our show will be right with you. Hello, and welcome back to the second half of this third episode of First Question. I'm here with pastoral assistant Dick Mickley because Dick recently had a Sunday in the pulpit, and one of the questions that we received from Roger Wade addressed sermons that both Dick and I had preached. We'll get to that in a minute, but first, Dick, how you doing today?
I'm doing fine, sir. I'm glad I'm not in the East Coast where the heat index is 106.
Wow. Hey, did you get woken up in the middle of the night by that thunderstorm?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did.
So did I.
Ended up with almost an inch of rain.
Wow. We needed it. We needed it. So, do we feel like we've covered enough small talk and bored people?
Whatever.
Okay.
I like the shirt.
Oh, yeah, and I like your shirt. I'm rocking the First Presbyterian t-shirt, and what do you have there?
I got one from the Presbyterian Church USA.
Right. That's good stuff. Our first question actually came from you. You wrote to me after my June 28th sermon, Doom, Gloom, and Glory. And since I got you here, Dick, why don't you go ahead and read your question to me?
Make sure I got it here. Do you think that this congregation, the ones you were talking to at Doom and Gloom, feels the image of middle-class white privilege?
It's a good question. And simple answer, I doubt it. Not because I think our congregation is dumb or doesn't recognize these things or is incapable of recognizing these things. I doubt it because one of the effects of white privilege is you don't have to acknowledge your own race. What we've learned, however, from Black, Indigenous, and people of color is that they don't get to live life unaware of their race. So why don't white people experience their race? I think that's because of white privilege. So yeah, when you ask if our congregation really feels the image of middle-class white privilege, I can only assume not, though to my mind at least, this actually proves the very existence of white privilege. Because again, one of the privileges of white privilege is not having to acknowledge whiteness. If anything has happened in our culture over the last few months, it's that white people have been forced to face their whiteness, even just a little bit. And wow, we were not prepared for that. Emotionally, relationally, socially, and spiritually, we did not have the internal or corporate resources available to us to handle this recognition of race. The result has been a lot of resentment, frustration, and anger. I'm sure you've seen some of that, on the social medias and that sort of thing. But if my approach is correct on this matter, then these few months of learning to be white should have softened our souls to the daily and even hourly plight of being non-white in America. And that's why I really wanted our congregation to participate in the Raising Racial Awareness event through the Presbytery. The murder of George Floyd and the subsequent protest raised our racial awareness. Like, that happened for everyone, but not necessarily in a way that was fully productive. It was necessary, not his death, but definitely the protests to it. But in terms of the best way to raise racial awareness, it was lacking. And so, thanks be to God that our presbytery has a gentler, communal, more spiritual way to raise racial awareness and has invited us to be part of it. Of course, the result of that, though, is that if someone doesn't avail themselves of good resources when they're provided for free, then the next time there's a George Floyd and protests, and God forbid that there will be a next time, even though I think we all know there will be, and white folks are forced to face their whiteness, and then they discover that they don't have the resources to face it, and then they're frustrated all over again. Well, if that pattern plays out one more time, then the blame will be on those white folks who didn't prepare themselves spiritually, even though they had ample opportunity to do so in a safe and thoughtful and faithful environment. That's why I see the Presbytery's program as more than an offer, but a full-on imperative. And I'm grateful for the 8 congregants who did step up to participate, yourself, Dick, being one of them, and hope that as we go ahead and make those same resources available to the rest of the congregation through our Facebook page, that they'll participate, even if not, formally participating in the Presbytery's discussions.
Interestingly enough, this morning I read the preparatory thing that they have for that.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of equates the same idea with the problem we have with COVID-19. It's one of those, we can be contagious way before we know that we've got the symptoms.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's one of the things we're going to deal with. But that starts tomorrow.
It does. Yeah. Dick and I are recording on Wednesday. We may not actually get this video uploaded until Friday, but there is still going to definitely be time for folks who want to participate in the Presbytery's Raising Racial Awareness to still hop on board, for sure. Dick, let me ask you, though, kind of a follow-up question. What, if anything, in your life has caused you to face your whiteness? And, how did you feel when that happened? How did you respond? And, if that has happened, in what ways were you changed by that experience?
Interestingly enough, my mom, when she remarried, married a African American whom I had known for forever almost.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't have a problem with that. But meeting with his friends was very strange. His mom and I'd sit over at the side, and the fellows would get together and talk about fishing.
Mm-hmm.
It was strange as to how do we deal with this strange mixture. I've never really had I haven't realized perhaps I do have a problem. I've had both black folks and African Americans in school with me. I had them, both all places I went to school. But one of the differences in Marion, we had a Jamaican as pastor of one of the mainline churches. And he felt more at home with us white folk because the African Americans said he's not one of them and shouldn't he.
Jamaica is a particularly interesting country in this regard, and in that if you grow up in Jamaica, you grow up with black men on your currency. And compare that to America, where you grow up with just old dead white men on your currency. And you can be a person of color and ascend to, the highest ranks of society on the norm. Like, it's not even like a special sort of thing. It's just the norm. And so, for folks who are like born and raised in Jamaica, when they come over to America, they don't recognize race in the same way as folks who are black or other people of color who are raised in America and, not raised with black folk on their currency. What's interesting, though, of course, racism is still racism. And, you can be a Jamaican who thinks that, like, some of these racial things are overblown, but if you encounter a racist, they're not going to regard you as anything other than a minority and a despised one at that, right? And so, that's one of the unfortunate things why, eventually all people of color find affinity with one another because they live in a culture where there's white privilege and in certain instances white supremacy.
Well, I think one of the strange things, we have a African American church in the presbytery, and we have some integrated churches. But I still think we have friendly relations with those folk, but there's still a strangeness to it.
Yeah, and that's just that's a good reminder of how powerful cultural forces are, because we would say theologically that we are all adopted sons and daughters in Christ, and that we have been made one family, and we can celebrate one another's differences without feeling different from one another. And yet, I think you're right. Like, historically black churches and predominantly white churches, they don't feel that sort of affinity with one another. And that's not a theological failing. That's just a sociological failing. Now, there's a case to be made that our theology should overrule our sociology. And that's maybe yet another reason for, churches to take on things like raising racial awareness, because this is how we truly live into our baptismal identity as Christians, rather than just perpetuate our sociological identity as white, black, or otherwise.
But one of the things, and really, I don't know how to say this, but it would be, they speak Bible different than we do.
Yeah. That's for sure. Because our lived experiences are always going to influence how we read the scriptures. And if anything, I'll just say that is a continued reason why, white churches and black churches need one another. Not because one has the authoritative interpretation and they want to like paternalistically force the other church to accept it, but because we probably can't read the Bible completely without one another. That we're always at best doing partial readings. There's an organization that go ahead.
One of the things I think we find, though, in the main churches is that Bible has to be read in the community. You can't do it by yourself.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And then we just need to keep expanding our definition of community to make sure we're reading it rightly. Yeah. Well, hey, let's get into questions. We got 2 questions. Well, really, it was like one topic spread over 2 emails from Roger Wade. And he was he was responding to, I think, my July 5th sermon, Cognitive Dissonance, and your July 12th sermon, Our Christian Identity. And so in his first letter, he writes, God's sovereignty has come up several times lately, it seems, including Dick's sermon today. I would like to have that topic expanded sometime. Now, I wrote him back pretty quickly and I said, yeah, man, that's kind of a really big topic. You want to give us a little bit of guidance on where you want us to go with that? Because, you know, Dick and I can talk. Like, we're good at talking. I'm a preacher. He's a lawyer. You know, this video might be 10 hours long. And so that's when he wrote back with a second letter. He said, the subject continues to be on my mind. This morning, as I was working in my garden and thinking about how I am so blessed while God, in his sovereignty, has chosen to bless others less. He describes a traumatic event in a neighbor's life, which I'm not going to read here because it's pretty personal. Describes another neighbor who has physical illness and injury that she's seeking to overcome. You know, another who struggles with COPD, another who struggles with knees that he needs replaced, but it can't happen. And then he says, well, first he asks, are you familiar with Chris Christopherson's song, Why Me, Lord? And I'll say, Roger, I'm far too young to know that. Maybe Dick does. And then he ends with, I often feel my gratitude toward my God just isn't enough. I am far from worthy. God chose me, and he chose to bless me. Why me? So, Roger, good questions there. And I think what Dick and I would like to do is talk a little bit about sovereignty generally, because it's kind of where you started, and then we'll filter into your, you know, more introspective and more specific and personal questions. So Dick, do you mind if I take a crack at just sovereignty in general?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Because I'll try and flesh out a little bit, because that was what my sermon was about, pretty much.
Right. So here's a little thing I do. I don't know if folks have noticed this. I'm a big fan of etymology. I like to know the root of words, because sometimes when we're using a word, understanding where it came from, like seeing its origins and then seeing where it is now, it gives that word a history and a story. And I have often found that I better understand the language I'm trying to use right now. And this is especially important for language that I hope is describing God. I better understand it if I learn where the word or words I use came from. And so I did that with sovereignty in preparation for Roger's question here. And it comes from the old, it comes from a mashup of the Old French souverain, and that just means super or above, and then the English word reign, which itself comes from the Latin rex regum, which is king. And so the English reign means leader or king. So sovereign is the one who is above the ruler, leader, or king. And I think the etymology of this word is important, because it shows how this word, at least for God, was needed in order to talk about how God was above earthly kings. And so in other words, if we didn't have earthly kings, we may not use the word sovereign for God, because it wouldn't make sense. Like, what is he above? It's literally saying he's above a king. If we don't have kings, then we don't use that word. And so, this is, I think, particularly interesting in America, because we tend to use sovereign to describe the authority that, for example, a state has above the federal government. You know, in the United States, the way our Constitution is written, states are sovereign from, federal oversight, except for in those places the Constitution gives federal authority. And we've heard a lot of that sort of talk around things like face masks. Like all of a sudden, everybody is getting a lesson in basic United States civics. And more often than that, we hear the word sovereign used in relation of one country to another. And so there's a reason that America just doesn't roll its tanks in on Ireland, because Ireland is a sovereign nation. And that is its rule. Ireland's rule is above our rule in its own lands. And we don't want to impede on another nation's sovereignty. And so I want to say that we probably, as a church, didn't use the language of sovereign for God until church was in a place where it had to distinguish between the authority of the state and the authority of God. And what was interesting as I dug deeper into this, our Book of Confessions fully supports this idea, fully confirms this. The only references to the sovereignty of God in the entire Book of Confessions for the PCUSA occurs in the Westminster Shorter and Longer Catechisms. And Westminster, of course, is written in England, where there is a royal crown. And so as I kept digging deeper, I found this riveting quote from the prefatory remarks in the Book of Confession. So this isn't part of the confession itself, but there's a 1 to 2 page contextual description for each of the confessions. The quote says this: "The Westminster Assembly," that was the ones who were tasked with coming up with the Westminster Confession of Faith and the Longer and Shorter Catechisms, "the Westminster Assembly conducted its work in a crisis atmosphere. Internal conflicts had nearly torn apart both England and the English Church. Political and religious problems were inseparable. Who should rule the church? Who should rule the state? What power should the king have?" That is the context for the, I think, half a dozen or so more uses of sovereign in those confessions, and especially those catechisms. It was birthed in a context of a contest between church and state. And so maybe, Dick, you can tell me if I'm being ridiculous or just a little too cheeky here, but maybe, especially as American Christians who don't have a political king over us, we should stop using the word sovereign. In other words, I think Roger's question has alerted me that maybe sovereign is not a precise enough word for us to talk about God. Or maybe we should create our own American equivalent. And so I present to you President. Did you get that? The the super, the above, president. We talk about God as the President, the authority over and above the president, and by extension, all elected officials. And so, Dick, I ask you, what do you think? Should we petition to have a new confession written so that we can work President into the Book of Confessions?
Are you going to write that, or am I?
I'll write it, and then since it's a confession, I'll let you do your lawyer work on it to make it more boring.
Thanks. Well, the first thing that you're talking about, you're talking about the Book of Confessions, I think there's a full confession, I think, given over to sovereignty. And it's the Barman Confession from 1934, in which the Reformed people, not all of them, went to Switzerland to avoid Nazism, and then wrote this great confession that talks about being against the Nazism that wanted to control the church. And there's a spot in the Confession of 67 that talks too about the U.S. or any government giving up sovereign. If they give up their sovereignty to the political people, they're not the church.
Mm-hmm.
But then,
it's about a contest of authority. And when we use sovereign for God, what we're trying to say is the contest is over. No authority is above God.
Right. Now, one of the things, and this is in an article called Metaphors for God, and it refers to a couple things in Isaiah. One of the problems we have. To whom then will you liken God? Or what likeness compare with him? It's Isaiah 40:18. Or further on, to whom will you compare me? Or who is my equal, says the Holy One. And that's Isaiah 40:25. But I think when I was doing the sermon, I started off with that. And I think generally there's an assumption on my part there is a sovereign who happens to be God, which I think is assumed in a lot of places because we can't really define it. The best I could do came out of a philosophical book I have that defines it. It's a civil definition. It's a person or institution who is held up to be sovereign, who exercises authority as a matter of right over everybody else in that system. And there's no competent authority to override them. But I think the problem we have I'll start with the Old Testament. The early Hebrews were not abstract thinkers, they were concrete. And it was far easier for them to describe something rather than to try to define it. And I'll start with the call to Abraham. Abraham, get up and go. To a place I will show you. And he went. There's no understanding of who this person is that is talking to Abraham. It just is. Like the definition given to Moses. What's your name? I am. That's not a definition, that's a description. And we go down through that, and I think basically in the Old Testament we refer to King of Kings. We don't use the word sovereign. I looked it up in the Concordance, which is a book that has every word in the Bible listed and tells you where to find it. Sovereign isn't in the book. King and Lord is. The New Testament is more inclined to use Lord than it is King, except where they're referring to the civil government, and it's Lord of Lords. Still, this is a higher Lord than the rest of them. This is a higher God than a little God. So that's, I think, where I come up with who this sovereign is.
No, that's good. I appreciate those insights. Especially the difference between defining and describing, and then recognizing that sovereign is itself a theological category, not a scriptural one. Now, that shouldn't detract from it. We have a number of theological categories, and especially theological words that don't appear in Scripture itself, but are still invaluable. The best example, and you brought this up, Dick, while we were preparing for this conversation, Trinity. You're not going to get Trinity anywhere in the New Testament, and yet an essential theological word to help us as the people of God understand who God is. But at the same time, as much as we have to be open to theological words, we'd be better off ourselves following our Jewish forebears and learning to describe God in the ways that God has revealed God's self, rather than try to define God by other outside categories. And maybe part of the trouble with sovereign is it's somewhere between that good description and maybe that questionable definition. Now, I want to say that if we are going to describe God as God reveals himself, then, and that's the only way we can make the shift to Roger's second question, which I want to say, if I had to summarize Roger's second question, is really like, what do we do with a sovereign God and suffering in the world? And there's a certain amount of lament maybe that he doesn't suffer in the way his neighbors do, and I think if that is the case, that's a very holy place to be. Paul at one point says that I could be cut off and accursed from God on behalf of all of Israel. Like, I would accept that. Like, Paul's willing to say he's willing to go to hell if all of Israel can glorify God fully in Jesus Christ. And so, yeah, I mean, good, faithful people always look at the sufferings of others, and there's a part of them that yearns to say, swamp me in there, spare them that suffering. And I think that very part of themselves is Jesus, who, I mean, if we understand the story of Jesus's incarnation, ministry, death, and resurrection, it is God sending God's Son to enter into suffering, that we might be pulled out of it. You look like you're going to say something. Go ahead, Dick.
Well, I'm thinking as you're going through that, one of the things in the Old Testament particularly, there's an understanding of God is out there. He's transcendent.
Mm-hmm.
But he has come to me. He's come to Abraham. He's come to the Isaacs, the Jacobs, Moses. He comes to them and becomes incarnate.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, he had to send Jesus to tell us, this is what I mean.
Yeah, and that's where it's important to not define God, but to describe him, which is to say, to use the stories of God to help us understand who this God is. And so if I see what Roger's asking for, I think he wants to know what's the bridge between sovereign and suffering. Because he can kind of understand the sovereign God, and he certainly knows suffering, but he wants to know what's that connection. And I think the connection is Jesus, the suffering servant, right? The way that God reveals God's self most fully, the way that we can describe God most accurately, is the one who enters into the suffering, right? And so if that's the case, then when Roger has seen the suffering of his neighbors and friends and family members, when he sees his own suffering, he is seeing the sovereign God present, the one who could sit, on a perch in an ivory tower, the one who could be the ruler above all, as the word sovereign literally means, is actually the one who enters into suffering with us and sanctifies suffering, makes it a place of absolute communion with God. And that's the best description we can make of God. And I think we should lean into that description more than any technical definitions of sovereign.
And I think the problem with why me, because I got a different answer than you do. I have a different answer than Roger does. We all have different answers. If we look at our past as to why I'm chosen.
Yeah.
Different paths for each one of us.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think he asks a good question. I also think he asks the sort of question that you and I can't answer. Like, I think he has to ask that question directly to God. Sorry, I know that's like we're punting on like the hardest question. Really living up to the quality of these first question videos. But Roger will figure out why me better than you and I can for him. I would say that if we're not suffering, as a general rule, we are instructed to suffer with those who suffer. And so if we're in a place where we're not suffering, we have the opportunity to enter into the lives of those who are suffering, to not bring Jesus with us, but to actually follow the Jesus we're already confident is present in all suffering. Did you freeze up on me there, Dick, or did I catch you in a really deeply contemplative moment?
And I think the best we can tell Roger is you're not alone.
Right.
Don't know. I was watching you. I have an internet connection that's unstable. It just told me.
No, that's okay. Everybody over these past 4 months have come to learn the limitations of Zoom, which we're recording on. Uh,
Yeah.
at least the photo that I saw that was frozen, you didn't look too absurd. So that's good news.
I will repeat maybe what thought I was saying.
Okay, go ahead.
The best we can tell Roger is you're not alone.
Hmm.
It's something we all deal with.
Yeah.
Now you're frozen a
Oh,
little bit.
I'm frozen a little bit. Okay. Well, the good news is I think we've probably given the best we can, and hopefully not the worst we have to these questions. And so, if Zoom is telling us to knock it off and wrap it up, then maybe we should listen to Zoom. You want to talk about a real sovereign? Boy, Zoom might just be it. Um, yeah, Dick, any final closing thoughts or reflections?
I don't think so.
Good. I don't really have any either. I just want to thank everybody again for taking the time to engage the whole process, for again watching the worship videos, for sending your first questions in, and then for watching these first question videos. We're going to do our best to continue to make these a meaningful part of the conversation that you are having with your God and that we are having as a community of faith together. And so with that, I bid you adieu. I send you with the grace and peace of Jesus Christ. And Dick, thank you for being here.
I'm not French, so I can just say Auf Wiedersehen.
All right.
Peace
All
and
right.
grace.
See ya.